Thank you. I too was excited by the topic. I thought it's something that really needs some attention. I do think it's something we need to really focus on, especially since modernization is becoming more and more of a topic both in the public and private sector. I have to admit I had mixed emotions when I read the sentence, the anatomy of the Frankenstein network. I just had so many bad things running through my head. I'm sure a lot of you can picture a lot of your own environment in there as well. And you know, as we modernize, obviously our goal is to try and bring our operations, our engineering, our IT, our information security in lockstep, because you know, how do we get to our Frankenstein networks that we have today? It's, you know, a typical scenario. We have IT project number 1 that just needs to be live. This thing's got to get in production. We've got a deadline. We've got to hit the business's timeline. We'll go back and we'll secure it after we launch it. Sound familiar? Now IT project 2 comes along, and by the way, this thing supersedes everything else we were doing because this has to be live, and now we'll exasperate the problem by going back later and integrating project 2 with project 1, and we'll secure project 2 later. And now you see why we have so many challenges defending the infrastructures that we have. So with that said, you know, why we must modernize for a national security priority, I'll throw the first question out to the team. You know, as we modernize, how do we correct these sins of the past and really integrate security into every aspect of that business, the engineering side, the operations side, the engineering process, and you know, work strategically with the environment to make sure we're building things that are scalable, are flexible and agile enough to change as the business change and not repeat those sins of the past. You'd like to jump first?
Great. Well, I guess I'll go. So what you described actually is in the software world what we call technical debt, right? And so it applies equally well to infrastructure and other parts of the enterprise. And I think there are a number of ways you can look to address them, but it does start with an acknowledgement that that has to be addressed in some way, and you have to apply resources to it. One of the things that we look at, you know, is taking an architectural view of some of these things. Again, my background is in software development, but if we look at the principles of applying simplicity wherever possible and applying flexibility wherever possible, as we're looking to modernize these systems, those principles will help us result in a stronger security posture. You know, one of the things that I guess for me, you know, if you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I do think that software-defined infrastructure actually really helps us in this modernization journey towards a better security posture, towards being able to adapt to changing needs. So as that second project comes in and you need to change certain elements of your infrastructure, if the infrastructure itself can be configured and is flexible enough to meet those changing needs, you are going to be in a much better posture. So fundamentally, why I believe, you know, sitting at DHS, this is a national security priority. Every mission we have is enabled by IT and enabled by technology. And so if those operators can't leverage the capabilities that technology provides, that's a national security problem for us. And that's why we take it very, very seriously.
Yeah, I think, you know, I remember the days when we used to be able to secure the network, and I'm pretty sure that had a lot to do with token ring network. So that gives, right? So
I'm with you. Yeah, we're dating ourselves.
So from my perspective, it's like, yeah, can't we stick with that? Well, no, the world moves on, and the compute architectures move on, and they have to evolve. I think one of the things that there's two things that I'm thinking about. One is the economic model, the total cost of ownership of the portfolio, because in reality, the fragile systems are the most expensive to maintain. And often fragile systems aren't even the core business systems because they don't get a lot of attention. And they end up on the balance sheet with costs. And so new capability that has security designed into it is actually much more cost effective from an economic standpoint than keeping these legacy systems, you know, evolving or just kind of maintaining it. So there's an economic value proposition to be had here as number one. Number two, for security professionals, I think we have to recognize that at least when I started in security, I was taught identify a risk framework, take your controls and align all your practices with those controls. Get a third party to do an attestation against that and declare victory that you're resilient. And that was the model. Now our whole, you know, governance model for cybersecurity is built on that fundamental premise. There's just one problem. There's one stakeholder group that really didn't buy into that model. All the audit stakeholders, internal, external, they all bought into that model. All our third-party governance processes are built on that foundation. Everybody bought in that model except for the threat actor. They're the only ones that didn't. And what they do is they fundamentally change their tactics based on conventional controls. So we have to design unconventional controls. And that's a bit of a break from what we've done in the past, because we have this view, if we just do the basics right, we'll be okay. And you know what? That's not resiliency in today's environment with the change of technology and the change of the threat actor landscape. We have to use unconventional controls. I'll give you an example. What's number one, we mentioned this earlier, number one threat today that we face is what? Phishing, right. What's the number one mitigant in terms of conventional controls? Every authoritative source says number one mitigant is? Yeah, user education, right? So exactly what are we teaching the end user? Let me think about this. Okay, you get an email, we want you not to trust that email. All right, that's essentially what we're doing. So we're spending time, effort, and money to extract trust from the email system. Now, is email important to anybody's enterprise out there? Because I think it is for mine, my enterprise. And from my perspective, I'd rather put a control in place that adds trust into email. Now, for phishing, there's 4 different types of phishing, right? The first and most commonly used type is spoofing the domain. You can eliminate spoofing of the domain by using DMARC and authenticating all your outbound email. Now, here's what happens when you do that. Number one, the email that gets delivered to the end consumer is your email coming from your servers, no one else's. What that means, in our case, 40% of the email delivered to the end consumer didn't get delivered because it was fraudulent. So all of that drops out. The net effect is that the trust level in the email system goes up. So we have a 10% gain in click-through rate every year because we use DMARC. So the sales and marketing people get a lift on all their campaigns. Now, what do their campaigns do in our case? Well, they create healthy lives. They're trying to change healthy behavior. So the consumers are healthier, it's more profitable, and it manages risk. So that's an unconventional control because it's not in any conventional risk framework today. But it's pretty compelling because the sales and marketing people actually like the CISO. How often does that happen? That never happens, right? So, but this is what unconventional controls do. So I think modernization using unconventional controls designed for the emerging architecture, there's a real economic value to be had there.
Great comments, Jim. If the definition of a Frankenstein network is mismatched parts cobbled together over a central nervous system, then I think, yeah, HHS has that. 11 operating divisions with diverse missions, stakeholders, and customers, everything from the Food and Drug Administration, trying to protect our prescription medication, medical devices, our food supply, to National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control, doing worldwide research and open information sharing paradigms, to Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, processing $1 million a minute in payments to patients, providers, and payers, to the Indian Health Service, providing critical point of access care to our Native American population. All of those, and there are others, operating divisions, have different threat profiles, risk profiles, and mashing that all together to make a coherent cybersecurity program, it's what I live for. My boss, Beth Kaloran, corralled all the CIOs and security officers from all those operating divisions over the course of a couple of months last year, and came up with a set of goals and standards in the form of a CIO work plan. And these work plan elements are tied to the performance evaluations of the senior executives in those institutions, and they're working towards implementing these work plans. Has to do with workforce, shared services, cybersecurity, of course, reducing legacy IT, all of those major muscle movements to get a large geographically diverse organization moving in the same direction on paper that the CIOs signed up for, and then monitoring those with monthly progress reports. And we treat them like a performance management review. So making those 11 diverse operating divisions operate together, focused on reducing legacy IT, and by that I mean moving towards shared services or core services that we should be in the business of providing, and outsourcing or pushing to the cloud everything that we shouldn't. Because every executive in HHS has a risk tolerance. Our new secretary has laid out the mandate that IT cannot be a burden to the people providing care. It has to be an enabler. We cannot stop the business of HHS and the healthcare sector that we are supporting because we want to implement security controls or get rid of legacy IT. We must figure out ways to enable that delivery of that service, delivery of all those various mission areas that HHS oversees or provides, using security as an enabler. That's what makes being in IT so exciting this time. If you're like me and you like bringing smart people together to solve very technical, very difficult problems, this is our time.
Thank you. That's great. That's also a great segue. So there's obviously a lot of work to do. You guys all described a lot of opportunity for modernization, but we don't have unlimited budget. So how do we go about, defining those highest value assets or, prioritizing that budget?
So I think we need a portfolio management approach. So there's a bunch of legacy systems that we have. So take legacy systems that are the highest cost to operate and divide them into two categories. The first is the ones that get a lot of attention, that support core business needs, and make that one category. The second category are those that aren't part of the core business. And then take the ones that aren't part of the core business and decommission them. And let people scream and yell that they don't have capability, because chances are they can probably migrate a lot of that functionality to existing systems anyway. So that's one part of the portfolio to do, and there's some pain associated with that. But the cost savings from that can be used to invest going forward in modernizing the rest of the portfolio. And so there's an economic incentive to actually invest in new technology. First of all, if organizations that use, depending on their accounting model, I mean, you can invest in software development and capital, and over a 3-year period, the cost is significantly less than maintaining existing systems where the cost is escalating every year. So there's some economic incentive to do that. So I think a portfolio management approach is the right way to approach that.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think at DHS what we are looking to do, and we're not there yet, but as we look across the entire portfolio of our systems, we're creating a framework, particularly for O&M systems that are in sustainment. We pay a lot of attention to acquisition systems and acquisition oversight, but not honestly where the bulk of our money is spent in sustainment. It's not as much oversight applied to those dollars, and so we're looking at a framework that can identify systems that need to be updated or modernized. And there are a couple frameworks for figuring out how we make those decisions. There's one, I think Gartner's framework, the tolerate, invest, migrate, or eliminate. And the systems that you can tolerate, you keep. The systems that need incremental investment to upgrade, you invest in. The ones that you need to migrate or completely rebuild, you do that. And you have a framework for applying to that portfolio for making those decisions. I also think that the concept of a high value asset is one that means different things to different people. And when you talk about it from a security perspective, I know at DHS, at MPPD, they're looking at defining a set of criteria that folks can use to evaluate the kinds of data, the risks of what happens if that data is lost or corrupted, what's the impact to the business, to other parts of the organization. Having a consistent framework for evaluating your assets to then decide which ones are high value, and actually I think a binary high value or not is probably not sufficient. You need really high value, really high value, so you can decide what kind of investment you need to apply. I think those are some of the things that we all need to consider, particularly at the large enterprise level.
HHS is taking the same approach. The CIO Council and CISO Council meet monthly, and they make risk-based decisions for IT investments in a wide category of areas across the HHS enterprise. Last year, HHS spent a little over $12 billion in IT, about $300 million of that in IT security. And all of those investments have to be done with a focus on high-value assets. Where can you buy down risk? Where can you transfer it? Where can you mitigate it? Or you just accept it. The CIO Council has instilled that framework, leveraging our partnership with DHS using the continuous diagnostic and mitigation program to implement a core set of tools across the enterprise to help us manage that risk. But CDM is not all inclusive, and HHS, working with our vendor partners, with DHS and with the industry, the healthcare sector, to make sure that the money we spend on IT and specifically in cybersecurity addresses our highest risks first.
Okay. We touched on enablement earlier, that being a key component of what we want to gain out of the modernizing effort. But there's always that war between enabling and then what security and risk bring to that model. So how do we enhance the security while still capitalizing on that enablement benefit? I can't talk after lunch.
That's right. Yeah, I think there's a fundamental perception that security controls require friction, because most of them do. Maybe that has something to do with it. But I think it's time for us to evolve beyond that, because there are ways to actually remove friction and improve security for the end user. And that, again, is going to the unconventional controls. I'll give you an example of that. Conventional controls today are binary authentication. Binary authentication is like login and password, right? If you have the login and password, you're in. If you don't, you're out. It's one or the other. It's binary. It's an event at the beginning of the application interaction, all right? We're moving to multi-factor authentication, which is multiple binary authentication. And that's better than single-factor authentication. We all agree on that. But we have to recognize that passwords are obsolete. In 2016, 3 billion passwords were harvested in North America. Last I checked, I think there was about 350 million of us in this country, so that means our passwords are being recycled many times. And that's led to, today, credential stuffing, where anybody can get access to login ID, say user ID and password from the dark web. I mean, I think Yahoo lost over 1 billion of them over a 3-year period. So if I get 10,000 of those, and I use a tool called Sentry MBA, and I rent that tool, I can take those 10,000 login credentials and apply to any enterprise. And I'm going to get a 2% hit, because we reuse passwords because we can't remember all the passwords that we have to register for all the sites that we have. So 2% of the time, I'm going to own the account. Now, if I want to get that up to 4% of the account, I put a prefix in between the password. So it's like Aetna password 123, and I get a 4% hit. That's 400 accounts that I now own, and I'm trusted as an adversary in a network. So that's pretty profitable, and the abundance of credentials on the dark web gives us this capability today. So the reality is we're using passwords today, but they're not a key control. They're no longer a key control. And more of your successful authentications are actually criminals in your system. So what do we do about that? We move to a behavioral-based model that's based on risks, where attributes and many attributes of the end user are consistently measured throughout the interaction of the mobile or web application. And each attribute has a risk score, and they're stacked up. And the ultimate risk score tells the app how much access to provide throughout the interaction. So it's behavioral-based, risk-based authentication. And it's an unconventional control. It's not, you won't find it in any risk framework, but in my organization and in our enterprise, we're eliminating passwords and we're moving to this model because it's actually far more effective than using passwords given the resources that are available to criminals today.
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting control, and I will say that the central tension you alluded to between increasing security posture and using modernization to increase our security posture, or even considering it as just not make it a burden on the end user, versus where I consider it as a critical enabler of capability for our mission operators or our users or our customers. And I do believe that when we look at modernization, and even the term modernization is one that sometimes strikes me as inaccurate or incomplete. We aren't simply modernizing. We should be really radically improving the performance of these systems, not just using modern technology. We need to focus on the outcomes that we're trying to drive with these modernization efforts, which is ultimately improved performance for the users or the mission operators. And I think that oftentimes in this conversation, we lose that focus on that outcome of improving performance. I do believe you can have both. I believe that, to your point, security controls don't have to be, have to have as much friction as they are perceived to, that we can actually improve our security posture through the application of modern technologies like automation in all our security processes, in our security operations, as well as our network defense, like machine learning and artificial intelligence. Those things all radically improve our security postures if applied correctly, but they don't have to impact the user. And that allows us to focus more resource on the capabilities that the IT, the technology is delivering in the hands of the end users. And I think we have to maintain that focus on the value, not just the risk.
At HHS, part of our job is to manage that message to the endpoint users, to the people who are going to be the beneficiaries of these controls we're trying to implement. Managing that message, not all the security controls we have available work in all situations, especially when it comes to providing medical care in various settings. Jim, your comments reminded me of an interaction I had at HIMSS earlier this year. I was walking around the demo floor, and an IT administrator from a Midwest radiology reading service came up to me and was asking me about how he could win the support of the doctors, the radiologists who read studies from home overnight for a variety of hospital care settings. And I gave him some suggestions, and as he departed, a radiologist came up and said, "Hey, I saw you talking to my IT guy. What were you telling him?" And I said, "Well, he was asking for some suggestions on securing these machines that reside in residences." And he goes, "Okay, if my home-based machine locks up while I'm reading a study, the next invasive procedure I perform is going to be on you." And I said, "Wait, I'm trying to help you, because many of these folks, they have family at home. They multi-purpose, multitask their machines, just trying to help." So my story, my message here is, not all security controls work in all situations. They need to be tailored to the use case for which they're designed.
So you guys brought up some really good points. I've heard the terms AI and machine learning. There was a session earlier on that, I think. We talked about automation. So can these modern technologies be used as part of, or can these modernized technologies be used to really help improve the people process and technology gaps that we have today?
They're already here. So what we're doing today is model-driven security. That's exactly what all of these examples are. And I think we have to come to grips with that, because it's hard enough finding cybersecurity talent. Now you have to teach them to be data scientists. Because the war that we're in today against the adversary is model versus model. May the best model win. So that's where we're making investments in creating models that are driving frontline security controls. So we have privileged user monitoring capability today where every single registered user in the network has a behavioral pattern based on their web browsing, their email usage, their entitlement information, their physical access. Any deviation from that triggers a risk threshold. And if the threshold's high enough, their privilege is removed automatically by the model, no human intervention. Now that's an example of a model driving a frontline security control. And that may sound futuristic, but that's here today, and that capability is here today. And the reality is that machine learning capability, specifically in point solutions today, is far easier to deploy than I ever imagined when I first encountered it a couple of years ago. Literally, we've got 5 applications in production today with machine learning driving frontline controls, and I suspect that will be 10 by the end of next year. So this is moving a lot more quickly than we think, and this represents the future. Customers today have a speed of working that humans will never keep up with. And as long as we provide capability in the online world, we have to recognize that models are the only way we're going to be able to do it.
Yeah, I think the question is not can they. I think the answer is you must use these modern technologies if you are to have any hope of prevailing in this highly asymmetric, warfare, right? The reality is that, we have to be successful in defending every time, and it only takes the attacker getting through one critical, gap, and you can be turned over very quickly. So to combat that, automation and machine learning and artificial intelligence are key technologies to help level that playing field, and the model-driven, obviously, combat is accurate. I will say that, we look at technology, again, in terms of the outcomes it can provide. The question that I have when we look at all those really impressive tools that are out there right now, today, not in the future, but today. The question is, what are the right ones to really solve the problems that we have? How do we sift through the massive amounts of potential point solutions to put together a strategy that really works and doesn't have any chinks in the armor? And that's actually nowhere near trivial. It's incredibly difficult because there's so much out there, and every vendor is telling you that we can solve all your problems, or we solve this problem better than anybody, and trying to figure out how to put all those pieces together in a comprehensive and effective way is really the biggest challenge in my view.
I think government has to embrace AI if it's going to be effective. With the push for a smaller, more agile, more efficient and effective government, it becomes harder and harder to hire and retain talented cybersecurity professionals in the government. So what do? We leverage our vendor partners, our government partners with tools, processes, and technology to secure the enterprise, and then focus the IT assets that might reside in various government organizations on the unique mission that we have. And it could be one of those mission areas that I discussed about securing medical devices, or helping bring the next prescription medication miracle drug to market. Focus on core missions, allow for AI and our partnerships with the industry and with other government agencies to secure the enterprise.
Great. I think we have maybe a minute or two left. Any closing thoughts for the group?
I have one thought, and this is the speed of the customer today. So I moved in August, bought a new home, and I needed a TV for the extra bedroom. Now, I had my really nice TV down in the family room, but I needed just a commodity TV. So I went online and I ordered a TV from Walmart, and I chose the make and model number, and they said, do you want it delivered to your home, or do you want to pick it up at the store? I said, I'll pick it up at the store. I didn't realize it at the time when I ordered that TV. I read about this a couple of months later, that the application that I used was designed with a business requirement that it had to deliver that fulfillment request in 15 milliseconds or less. Now, I thought about that for a minute, and I said, on my best day, I couldn't even discern 100 milliseconds, so what's 15 milliseconds? What do I care? But then, as I read about it, the business driver in that case, they didn't want to go back to their Bentonville, Arkansas data centers to pull accurate inventory data because of the time lag. So they decided to pull from a regional data source, and it's only 80% accurate. So 20% of the time, they have to ship product from one location to another to meet that fulfillment request. But they did all of that so they can get down into 14 milliseconds. So they 7 out, 7 back to make that fulfillment request. And the reason is because I wasn't the typical shopper. The typical shopper would have 5 browser sessions open, and each browser session, they'd have a different competitor looking at the products and comparing. And the first merchant to come back with the fulfillment request, they'd win the business. So that was the requirement. That's moving at the speed of a customer. Models are the only way to do that from a security standpoint.
That's great. No, I would say that I think, again, think of technology in what outcomes it can provide for your communities. Security has to be built in early. It has to be built in often. We can't tag it on at the end, but always remember at the end of the day, we're only securing these systems because they provide some value and outcome to our users or our customers at the end of the day. So don't forget that.
Thanks, Mike.
Quick thought.
My final thought is HHS working with our industry partners to address cybersecurity, not just at the large hospital and health payer systems, but the small and medium-sized doctors' offices all across the country maybe don't have embedded IT staff, and certainly not security staff. So we owe them a playbook of simple, understandable security controls that can provide a minimal level of protection to their environment, and maybe protect them from some of these persistent threats that seem to be propagating across the country. Look forward to working with industry and our partners on that initiative.
Thank you, gentlemen. This was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.